So this is a brief history of clinical mental health counseling. We start with Frank Parsons, who opened the Vocational Bureau in Boston in 1908. He used assessment interviews, counseling, and information to help young workers going into the workforce. He advocated for developing a clear understanding of individuals' aptitudes, their interests, their values, their ambitions, their resources, their strengths and weaknesses, and he combined that with a knowledge of the workforce in order to help people enter the workforce. He also began counselor training, and he organized the vocational process. So our next instrumental person of interest is Clifford W. Beers. And Clifford Beers is considered the founder of the mental hygiene movement. He had a suicide attempt after suffering from depression and anxiety and actually spent 3 years institutionalized and was really mistreated and went through some awful conditions that inspired him to write the book A Mind That Found Itself, to advocate for the improvement of institutionalized care and to treat people who were what they would call back then insane with the same respect as a sane person. Abraham and Hannah Stone were the first to have services outside of a school setting, and they focused mainly on marriage counseling and sex counseling, and they opened a first marriage counseling center in New York City. So in 1952, the American Counseling Association was founded. It was called the American Personnel and Guidance Association back then. And its whole purpose was to organize professional groups in guidance and counseling. And they started with 4 divisions. They started with the National Vocation Guidance Association, the National Association of Guidance and Counselor Trainers, the Student Personnel Association for Teachers Education, and the American College Personnel Association. So they started with these 4 divisions that all came together to form this group to help organize branches under a bigger umbrella. They've rebranded twice, and since 1992 have been the ACA, the American Counseling Association. The Community Mental Health Act of 1963 was instrumental because it started to shift funds away from large institutions to smaller community mental health programs. And the purpose of this was really to try to put an end to the inhumane conditions that people like Clifford Beers described in the larger institutions. And also there was more research coming out that showed a better evidence base for treatment in smaller community centers instead of these large institutions. But despite the promises to open 1,000 institutions and community models in each state, we still have insufficient alternatives. So basically we got rid of the large institutions and we didn't replace them with anything that could give us sufficient coverage for mental health care. So even though this was an instrumental act in starting to move healthcare where it needed to be for mental health issues, it still hasn't really fulfilled what it set out to do, and we have lots of people still waiting on mental health services that can't find it today because we have gotten rid of so many of the larger institutions. Carl Rogers came along in around the 80s, 70s, started talking about how counseling should be focused on the client, and the client is the best expert for themselves. And he really started the humanist movement. he wanted to focus more on empowering people instead of just managing the symptoms of the mental health issues as we were focusing on before. He also established core conditions of counseling and gave a new perspective on what a therapeutic relationship is between a counselor and a client. The American Mental Health Counseling Association was founded in 1978. Counselors had started these professions outside the school setting in the 70s, and we know even before them with Abraham and Hannah Stone, they were starting services outside of the school setting. But the APJ still continued to only train with the school setting in mind. So counselors, especially in Florida and Wisconsin, started advocating for this new division, and it was established in 1978. Today we have the National Board for Certified Counselors, established in 1982, and we also have the American Association of State Counseling Boards, which was established to help communication about licensure across states. So today, clinical mental health counselors provide flexible, consumer-oriented therapy and are able to assess, diagnose, have treatment planning, implement treatments, and even things like addiction therapy, crisis management, or just short-term solution-focused therapy are all part of the clinical mental health counselor's wheelhouse. Currently, the majority of clinical mental health counselors work in individual and family services or outpatient care centers. And the requirements for licensure is a master's degree in counseling or a closely related field, 2 years minimum supervised clinical work, and to pass the national license exam or a state license exam. So that's a brief history of clinical mental health counseling. Here are my resources. And thank you.